Hello, everybody, and welcome to another installment in our series of conversations on law in time of crisis. We are very pleased to be joined today by one of the newest members of the Brooklyn Law School faculty, Frank Pasquale, who is new to us, although he did visit on our faculty last year. He is one of the most recognized scholars nationally on issues of artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithmic decision-making, and the application of those issues and the legal questions they raise in various fields, including, most significantly for today's conversation, healthcare. I can take a minute to note that Frank is the author of multiple books. So if you're interested in this conversation and want to know more, you can hunt down his book on algorithmic decision-making, The Black Box Society, Harvard University Press. And Frank is the author or editor of two books that are coming out this year, one on the new laws of robotics, also from Harvard, and an Oxford handbook to the ethics of artificial intelligence. So look for those online if you are interested in these topics. Let's dive right in. Frank, so you're interested in big data and artificial intelligence and specifically health data. What drew you to this field? How did you come to study health data?
Well, back in the 2000s, seems like a long time ago now, I was really interested in both search engines and how Google works and how law would affect it. And I was also doing a lot of work on healthcare finance. And as I was working on those two different streams, they sort of came together when I found increasingly people were saying that the solution to America's healthcare crises would be to use data better. So lots of people were saying if we could understand exactly which drugs work better, what courses of treatment work better, that would be great. But the problem becomes that it's often very difficult to collect and analyze data well. And so that's one reason why I got into, what are the laws here? What is the privacy law, intellectual property law, medical reimbursement? All those come together in the health data context.
And what are some of the legal issues that intersect with that project of trying to use data to make people's healthcare better?
One of the big issues that comes up is privacy, right? So we want to have lots of good intentioned people analyzing this data, but we don't want it to be used against us. And a really good example of this is, for example, research on Parkinson's disease and mouse clicks. So just by using your mouse on your computer, you have micro tremors that you wouldn't even notice, but that are being tracked on almost every website that you visit. And a researcher at Microsoft found out that certain tremors correlated with someone 6 months later searching for symptoms of Parkinson's and what to do about Parkinson's. So in some way, if this research bears out, people on random websites you visit can predict if you have Parkinson's before your doctor will know or you would know, right? Or at least would know that, say, 80% of the people with your tremors have Parkinson's. Now, on the one hand, this could be very useful data to tell your doctor, right? To know early on. And I don't know exactly with Parkinson's disease, but I'm sure there are many conditions where if you know early on, you can take action and help yourself. But there are also other areas where it would be very bad, right? I don't want my life insurer to be given this data, or my employer or other entities. And so the question for law is, how do you make sure that that sort of data is used for your good, but is not used in an unfair, discriminatory way?
But now, of course, we're dealing with a particular healthcare global crisis. Maybe you can describe how these issues have arisen, both in terms of healthcare and in terms of legal issues in the context of COVID-19.
Yes, I mean, it's really remarkable the number of new issues that have been raised. And one of the issues that comes up is, for example, providers may want to know if someone comes to the ER, have they had a COVID test before? Has this person tested positive before, et cetera, that type of data. And there are some emergency use authorizations that have already been put out by the Department of Health and Human Services to help out in situations like that. Other scenarios are research, right? So the CDC, the government may want it, or private entities may want tons of data and say, we want to analyze all the COVID cases and what happened, for example, when you took a particular course of action or didn't take a particular course of action, just for medical research purposes. And that's a big demand for data there. And then also, I mean, and this is just three, I think, examples that I think really dramatize it. People want to know, people want to be able to have access to, say, COVID tests. They may say, well, I had like something like a cold in March. Do I have antibodies, et cetera? And the regulation of access to those sorts of things is incredibly controversial right now, because on the one hand, you want to make sure that you keep those tests for the people most in need. On the other hand, we also want to create commercial incentives to make sure there's as many tests as possible out there. And finally, how do we verify that these tests are accurate? Apparently, there was a news story recently that half of the tests that the White House uses are not accurate. And so this is really troubling that you have a failure rate, false positive, false negative rates that are extremely high with some of the tests used at the very top levels of the country. So these are really tough issues in both health regulation and health data policy as well.
Wow. So I am actually going this afternoon to get a COVID antibody test because they're now available for free. Is there anything I should be thinking about before I do that, or should I read whatever waiver I'm asked to sign in a careful way, or how should I interpret the result of that test once I have it?
It's such a tough question, isn't it? Because one thing that I think is very useful in these types of scenarios is to look into exactly how accurate is the test, what is the rate of false positives and false negatives, because I do worry that people may put too much stock in like particular test results. And fortunately, FDA and other entities are trying to make sure that this type of data is publicly available. On the privacy side and the data side, one thing that's been really remarkable worldwide is the problems with privacy policies of different apps. So I know this is a test is very different than an app or a contact exposure notification or contact tracing app. But for example, with the NHS app in England, a lot of experts said this data should be destroyed after the crisis, right? That it's a matter of like public urgency that we keep the data now, but destroy it after the crisis. It turns out that in the terms of service ultimately released, they say we plan, if someone tests positive, to keep this for 20 years, right? Huh. And so it's kind of remarkable, when you think about that, that's just England. In the US, I think that the North Dakota contact tracing app already was accused of violating its terms of service. Huh. So I do think it's worth reading those waivers, and I think it's worth but one good thing that we teach in healthcare law is that in many areas of our life, a contract, if you sign a contract and say, I disclaim all liability and I won't sue you, you are often stuck with that. In healthcare, there's a big line of cases that says you can't do that, right? You can't sign away your right to sue for malpractice. If the doctor says, well, to see me, you need to promise you won't sue. Right. Courts are really skeptical of that. And hopefully they would be skeptical of any overly expansive waiver in your case as well.
We were talking for a moment before we started recording this about your work with the Department of Health and Human Services and all of the things that you've been advising them on in the context of this pandemic. Maybe you could tell us a few words about what kinds of issues you're addressing and what kinds of help they're seeking and you're giving.
Yes. So I was really honored to be asked to be part of the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics, NCVHS. This is a committee that has existed for decades as an advisory committee to HHS, and it brings together doctors, public health researchers, healthcare providers, like people from insurance companies, hospitals, et cetera, and lawyers to come together and to talk about how do we build a health infrastructure that is reliable, that is, that we can count on, that we know that the data is valid and we have data integrity, but also that we protect privacy, confidentiality, and security. And that's the committee I presently chair. I chair a subcommittee within the committee called Privacy, Confidentiality, and Security. And so we're now on at least a couple tracks. One track is to think about what is the larger long-term implications of public health surveillance infrastructure in the US and how to build trusted public health surveillance infrastructure, right? Where when people are being watched for, in the case of the next pandemic, how can we build institutions that can very rapidly identify potential pandemics, but also make sure that that data is kept private, that it's confidential, and it's secure to the greatest extent possible. We're also asked to provide some spot advice or to look for a toolkit or best practices for entities that want to share health data now. Because there's lots of unclear laws out there. With health data, you've got to deal with both federal law and the state law. So say, for example, that you had a hospital that really wanted to, or hospitals that wanted to pool all of their data, to understand exactly what the trends were, what worked, what didn't, et cetera. Do they have to ask the patients for permission to do that? by and large, if they keep off identifiers, they don't, right? If they keep your name off and there's a whole list of identifiers and other things, they can anonymize the data. But then there's also problems because sometimes you can re-identify the data, right? And so, even people that try to anonymize well, it can be re-identified.
Right.
So those questions come up as well. So yeah, so there's a long-term vision of building this type of infrastructure for data collection, reporting, and analysis. And then there are more short-term projects to make sure that people are, when they try to do the right thing, they do it mindful of privacy, confidentiality, and security.
I noted at the outset that you're a prolific scholar about these and other issues. As you've been working with HHS or just thinking about the pandemic, are there particular ways in which it's generated new scholarly projects for you, or maybe made you rethink some of the things that you've already done?
Yes, yeah. I mean, one article I started out with here, and viewers can find this with a Google search, is called "Grand Bargains for Big Data." And this was a 2013 article where I was arguing that essentially we will give up, if we give up a lot of our privacy and a lot of information about ourselves, has to be part of a grand bargain where we understand how that data is being used. And I think in healthcare, a lot of the time we do understand it. We are able, or at least we're in principle able to get to that. In much of the rest of the economy, we don't. So we have to get that grand bargain. I think for the future, one thing that I'm just really interested in is comparative research. So I'm in touch with folks in the Netherlands, Australia, and Taiwan. And I'm particularly happy to be in touch with Australia and Taiwan because they have done so well during this crisis. So what I'm trying to do is to understand, how did they do it? How did they have an infrastructure in place of data law that enabled really effective public health reactions? South Korea also is a great story there, where they, thanks to the MIRS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome it was called, from 2014, they put in place all of these new laws that were about how do we collect data in a responsible way. It's not perfect by any means, but I think there's so much we can learn from countries that have had a more successful response than the US has had.
Very interesting set of projects. Maybe to change gears just a bit as a final question, maybe you could talk a little bit about what you plan to be teaching and whether any of the things that you'll be teaching have been informed by very recent events.
Absolutely, yeah. So the two courses are, larger courses are called Health Law and Policy, where when I was teaching that last semester at Maryland, I mean, every class toward the end, I had like about 15 to 30 minutes saying, here's the implications for COVID. For example, we talked about end-of-life care, organ allocation, and who gets organs is very similar to the type of thought process that goes into who gets ventilators, right? If there's a shortage of ventilators. So those are very concrete things we talk about legally in health law and policy. Copyright, not as directly related, but I will be doing it. It's a very important, good thing to know about. And then there's two seminars, one on health information, which is totally up this alley in terms of looking at how information is created. And a final one that's right on point called Health Data Analysis and Advocacy. Mm. In that one, we look at data and data visualization. How are they used to tell a story in law and policy? And you totally see that right now with the COVID reopening data. You might have seen online, there was a chart from Georgia that was meant to say, our cases are going down, so we should reopen. But it turned out that on the chart, they had rearranged the dates so that some May dates came before April dates, right? Oh. And so this was a particularly bad example of like a bad data visualization, but it shows that like there's all sorts of things going on now with the collection of health data where it's being biased. It's biased by the predilections or the political agenda of the people who are collecting the data. And so what we talk about in that class is, how has that happened in various parts of healthcare? How has law dealt with it? And also as an advocate, how do you become aware of if your opponent is doing this sort of thing? And how do you call them out on it and make sure that the legal system doesn't make the decision on the basis of bad data?
Well, we look forward to having you teach them, and it has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much, Frank Pasquale. For another month or so, I guess, you'll be Piper and Marbury Professor of Law at University of Maryland, but I'm delighted that as of July 1st, you will be a professor on the Brooklyn Law School faculty. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you who have been watching, and stay tuned and be on the lookout for our next installment in this series on law in time of crisis.